On debate, Senator Simons.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I too rise today to speak to motion number 139 and to add my voice to those of my colleagues, led by the Honourable Senator Salma Ataullahjan, calling on the Government of Canada to recognize the erasure of Afghan women and girls from public life in Afghanistan as a form of gender apartheid. Ottawa, as we know, is a city of remarkable memorials, as befits our national capital. But for me, one of the most poignant and powerful isn't in the parliamentary district. It's the Afghanistan Memorial Hall, a 30-minute drive from here at National Defence Headquarters, Carling. If you haven't yet had the chance to visit, let me tell you a bit about it. Tucked into the center of the sprawling Carling campus, the Memorial Pavilion is a striking building, low-slung, sharp-edged. Its front walls are slabs of highly polished black marble, buffed to such a shine that they reflect the sky above. On them are engraved the words, "We will remember them. Nous nous souviendrons d'eux." Step inside and the pavilion is filled with light. Floor-to-ceiling windows look out onto a forest wilderness, white in winter, lush green as now when summer finally comes. The hall is a tribute to the Canadians who died serving in Afghanistan, 158 military personnel and 7 civilians. It also recognizes and commemorates the U.S. servicemen and women who died while under Canadian command. In the center of the memorial is a large, rough rock, a boulder. Taliban fighters used this self-same rock as a roadblock to force a Canadian military vehicle off the road. The attack was successful, fatally so. And so the Canadian soldiers decided that this particular boulder would never be used to kill another Canadian. They lugged it to their base in Kandahar, and it became the start of a makeshift memorial, a haunting cenotaph the soldiers built for themselves, for their own. The formal cenotaph is made from Afghan white marble and displays the names and photos, the birth dates and birthplaces and death dates and death places of the fallen. Walking through the hall on my first visit there 5 summers ago took my breath away. I recognized and remembered so many of those names and faces from my days writing for the Edmonton Journal. The first Canadians who died, Sergeant Marc Léger, Corporal Ainsworth Dyer, Private Richard Green, Private Nathan Smith. All 4 were members of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry based at Canadian Forces Base Edmonton. They were killed by Americans, not Afghans, in a friendly fire incident on April 17, 2002. And I covered their massive public memorial service held at the hockey arena the Edmonton Oilers then called home. Thousands of Edmontonians and Albertans turned out on that bright April day, shocked and stricken by the horror of such pointless accidental loss. But those 4 deaths were only the first of many. Over the years, the news stories continued, but the big public memorials gradually stopped. The losses of Canadians in Afghanistan slowly became, if not routine, then something that no longer surprised us. But in Kandahar, this grassroots memorial kept growing. As I walked through the cenotaph, I saw the memorial plaque for Corporal Nicola Goddard, the young Calgary woman and officer in the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery who died on May 17, 2006. I saw the plaque for Michelle Lang, my colleague from the Calgary Herald, who was killed by a Taliban IED, an improvised explosive device, while on assignment in Kandahar in 2009. 2 brave Alberta women who sacrificed themselves to serve not just the people of Canada, but the people, and perhaps especially, the women of Afghanistan. So many Alberta names and faces, a powerful reminder of how deeply this war so many miles away touched and scarred my province and my city. Because Edmonton and Alberta took the war in Afghanistan personally. So many Albertans served in Kandahar in particular. And so many of my Edmonton Journal newsroom colleagues went to Kabul and Kandahar to bear witness, to bring back the stories of horror and death, but also of courage and compassion and hope. The Afghanistan Memorial Hall is black and white and gray. As black and white as we thought the issues were in the wake of 9/11, as gray as they seemed when Canada left Afghanistan in 2011. By a strange twist of timing, I became an opinion columnist at the Edmonton Journal, rather than just a reporter, on September 10th, 2001. The next day, the Twin Towers came crashing down, and the world we thought we knew blew apart. And suddenly I was expected to have a lot of opinions about things I frankly knew little about, including whether Canada should join the fighting in Afghanistan. It seemed relatively clear to me, even through the fog of war, that the American and British war efforts in Iraq were not supportable. But the issues in Afghanistan seemed very different. I never believed that it made sense for Canada to commit thousands of troops to the Afghan mission simply to punish the Taliban for their support of Osama bin Laden. But as a young feminist, I had spent years reading about the grotesque oppressions the Taliban had inflicted on the women and girls of Afghanistan. The stories were horrific, and I was awestruck by the courage of the journalists, many of them women, who brought those stories to the world. So despite the human costs of war, despite the physical dangers and the moral hazards of intervening in the affairs of a country that had defied and destroyed occupying forces from Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States over the years, I backed Canada's mission in Afghanistan, not so much to fight international terrorism or end the drug trade or even stabilize the region, but to liberate the women and girls of Afghanistan from Taliban oppression. Perhaps that was naive. Perhaps my optimism about the potential for Canadian involvement was tinged with a fair bit of neo-colonial white saviorism. But for a time, the efforts of the world to free Afghan women from misogynist tyranny seemed to work. Afghan girls could once again go to school. Afghan women could walk the streets without male supervision and enforced dress codes. Women weren't just allowed to work. They were allowed to take leadership roles as teachers and doctors, journalists and judges, politicians and artists and lawyers. Life in Afghanistan without the Taliban certainly wasn't easy, but women were freed from the semi-slavery of the Taliban's toxic fear and hatred of the female sex. The dictatorship of the incels seemed to be over. And then, in February of 2020, Donald Trump's American government signed a peace agreement with the Taliban, an agreement reached without the consent or consideration of the Afghan government. But if anyone ever actually imagined that a deal between Trump and the Taliban would bring peace to anywhere, they were woefully mistaken. In August of 2021, Kabul fell to the Taliban, and any illusions anyone had cherished that the Taliban 2.0 were somehow a kinder, gentler version of the original model were quickly dashed, with Afghanistan's women and girls being stripped of their rights and liberties and returned to second-class status. Though actually, second-class status doesn't begin to describe accurately the unpersoning of Afghan women. Now, as a person of Jewish and German descent, I don't draw parallels with Nazis lightly, but it is the most apt analogy I can think of here. The Nazis used the term Untermenschen, undermen, to apply to Jews, to homosexuals, to the Roma, to Slavs, anyone they deemed subhuman. And by stripping such people of their very humanity, they were able to rationalize their lethal oppression. But if we look at the entire scope and sweep of human history, I'd argue that women were the original Untermenschen, that we have been fighting for thousands of years all over the world to have our humanity and equality recognized. Misogyny is one of the oldest of hatreds, and a near universal one, practiced by cultures and religious faiths all around the world since time immemorial. For centuries, for millennia, men were explicitly taught that women were not only inferior, but dangerous. Our sexuality was demonized, as was our intellect. It wasn't until the late 19th century that women in North America and Western Europe were able to gain any kind of legal and political power, and it was only in 1929 that women in Canada were recognized as legal persons, as people. And indeed, it was not until the late 20th century that we achieved anything close to political or legal equality. And the closer we have come to being recognized as fully human, the more vicious the political and cultural backlash. The Taliban's particular form of weaponized misogyny, born out of a deadly combination of fear and hate, is uniquely dangerous in this moment to the women of Afghanistan. But it is also an infectious toxin and a threat to women everywhere in the world, including Canada, because it models and normalizes the erasure of women from public life and from civil liberties. We have only to look south to the United States to see what happens when a Supreme Court infused with fundamentalist Christian misogyny throws out decades of settled law to rule that women do not have the right to control their own bodies, do not have the right to life-saving medical care. So much for the separation of church and state. So much for equality under the law. So much for rights that we thought were safe and sacrosanct. I want to rage and I want to weep when I think of the promises we in Canada made to the women of Afghanistan. And I want to rage and weep once more when I think about all the Canadians who fought and died, or who fought and were wounded physically and psychologically in the name of bringing peace, stability, and liberty to Afghanistan and its women. As the world turns a blind eye to the campaign of horror being waged against Afghanistan's women and girls, we make a mockery of the sacrifice so many Canadians made for that country's future hopes. What of the rest of us? In a world where good journalism is disappearing and Canadian foreign correspondents are becoming almost figures of myth, and where the infotainment cycle spins as fast as a carnival ride, we cared about Afghanistan for a few weeks after Kabul fell, and then the crisis was pushed aside by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, by the Hamas terror attack on Israel, by Israel's reprisals in Gaza, by Stormy Daniels and Donald Trump and the three-ring circus of American electoral politics. And while we look away or look at our phones, the women and girls of Afghanistan, to whom we promised and pledged so much, suffer. So yes, let's call it gender apartheid. But naming the evil is just the start. What matters more than what we call it is what we're going to do to fight it, to oppose misogynist political terror in Afghanistan and around the world. Thank you. Merci. Hi, hi.